Okay, so for the final video in this series, we'll be talking about Pascal's wager. Not so much a proof for God, but a practical reasoning heuristic based on expected utility for determining that one ought to, as a matter of practical rational activity, believe in God. So Pascal says, God is or he is not. But to which side shall we incline? Reason can decide nothing here. There is an infinite chaos which separated us. A game is being played at the extremity of this infinite distance where heads or tails will turn up. Which will you choose then? Let us see. Since you must choose, let us see which interests you least. You have two things to lose, the true and the good, and two things to stake, your reason and your will, your knowledge and your happiness. And your nature has two things to shun, error and misery. Your reason is no more shocked in choosing one rather than the other, since you must of necessity choose. But your happiness? Let us weigh the gain and the loss in wagering that God is. If you gain all. If you lose nothing. Wager then, without hesitation, that he is. I love this quote. I think it's beautiful. It's powerful. It was written, I want to say Pascal was alive in like 1400-ish. So it's really old. But it's poetic, it's simple, it's beautiful, and it captures everything that we're about to break down using our expected utility theory that we learned a couple videos ago. And it tells us that in spite of everything, we ought to wager that God is. If we were making a bet, we'd be better off betting for God's existence than against it. So, we characterize decision problems, because this is a decision problem, it's a wager. What should we do? Do we wager on God's existence or not? And to characterize decision problems, we use a table that shows acts A and B, and the utilities of the consequences of each possible act in each state of affairs, X and Y. So the utility of A given X, and the utility of B given X, and likewise the utility of A given Y, and B given Y. And we show how they all interact. And this setup is due to Pascal, due to this quote that I just read. This is where our game theory and our expected utility calculations come from. And so Pascal's partition is as follows. That we have two acts. We can act as an atheist, which I'll denote as A, or we can act as a believer, which I'll denote as B. And there's two states of affairs. Either God exists or God does not exist. God existing being G, God not existing being N. How do we fill out the probabilities? So what I've done here is I've attached this chart. This tells us that there's theism, atheism, agnosticism, and Gnosticism. To be an atheist agnostic is to say, I withhold belief and certainty as to whether or not God exists. Now, it's the same thing for an agnostic theist. A is the Latin suffix for not, and Gnostic or Gnosticism is belief or to believe. So agnosticism simply means not belief, without belief, the negation of belief. Atheism, likewise, is the negation of theism, where theism is just the belief in a God. So if we're assigning probabilities, we'll begin by assuming a perfect agnosticism, that we will make no judgment. We have no belief. All we're interested in is pure numbers. And so, given a perfect agnosticism, we'll assign probabilities to God's existence as 0.5 and God's non-existence as 0.5, that it's a coin toss. Because if I don't have any sort of increase in confidence or degree of belief in one way or the other, if I'm perfectly agnostic, then I'm going to withhold any sort of judgment as to the likelihood of God's existing or not. And so I give a 50-50, or a 1/2 probability to both outcomes, both possible options that God exists or not. So now we have our probabilities. We need to assign utilities to the different outcomes. So Mark 16:16 in the Bible says, "He that believeth and is baptized shall be saved, but he that believeth not shall be damned." So failing to believe in God, should God exist, results in a terrible penalty, eternal damnation. You go to hell. It's really bad. And so we're going to call this utility of going to hell negative infinity. You suffer eternally in the fiery pits of whatever layer of Dante's Inferno you end up in. But we also have this first half that he that believeth and is baptized shall be saved. So if God exists and you believe in God, then you go to heaven. And we're going to call this an infinite utility, that you get the joy of heaven forever and ever and ever and ever, right? It's really fantastic there. You should believe in God and hope that God exists because you get infinite utility. If getting Brahms ice cream for me from Oklahoma is worth 50 utility because it's delicious, and perhaps making it through all of the red lights on my way to work as green lights gives me maybe 10 utility because it's really satisfying to drive through a road full of green lights, right? Then going to heaven is infinite utility. It's so much better than green lights and Brahms ice cream. And so we assign being an atheist and God's existing negative infinite utility. You go to hell, right? God exists, you're an atheist, you go to hell. And we assign belief in God and God's existence positive infinite utility. You go to heaven. You enjoy the beatific vision for eternity. And perhaps we'll say that if you're an atheist and God doesn't exist, then you get zero utility, right? That you didn't waste time praying to some God that doesn't exist, but you didn't get the community or whatever, so it's sort of a wash. You didn't waste any time, but you didn't take part in church. So zero utility. But say you're a believer and God doesn't exist. This would be maybe Pascal's belief, given the community in which he grew up in the 1400s, which is that you get 1,000 utility even if no God exists, because you're taking part in the society of the religious community, which was really important way back when, because to be an atheist openly at that time in Europe, you would be ostracized. So even if you believe in God, it's really good to believe in God, even if there is no God, according to Pascal. And so we have this dominance rule. This is a really important rule for expected utility theory. And it says that if in at least one state of affairs, these being our states of affairs, these are our acts, these are our states of affairs. If in at least one state of affair, one act has more utility than every other act, and if in no state of affairs has less utility, then this act dominates the others. So if there's one of these squares, right, in our chart that has more utility than every other, right, and never has less in that act, then that act dominates. Belief satisfies these conditions. So in every case, belief is higher than any of the outcomes in utility than being an atheist, and it's never lower. So no matter what you do, you're always better off believing. Therefore, according to Pascal's wager, one ought to believe in God. So again, the quote from Mark 16:16, failing to believe in God, should God exist, results in eternal damnation. And believing in God gives you infinite utility. Now, let's change the numbers a little bit so that we break this dominance rule. If you believe in God and God does not exist, then maybe you've missed out on some secular opportunity, right? That we don't live in the 1400s anymore. Being a part of the church isn't a necessary feature of existing in society generally, that perhaps even spending your Sundays in church and then going to lunch afterwards and praying before bed every night is a whole big fat waste of energy when you could be reading books and studying whatever it is, like foreign languages on Duolingo. You could be spending your time productively outside of the scope of a theological practice. And so by believing in God, you commit yourself to spending your Sundays going to church and eating lunch, and your evenings to praying rather than learning foreign languages on Duolingo. So you're missing out on some secular opportunity should God not exist. So we're going to say that belief in God, but God doesn't exist, gives you a negative 500 utility. That you lose a bunch of utility because you've spent a whole life believing in something that isn't actually the case. And so we're going to reform our chart, right? That being an atheist, when God exists, sends you to hell. Being a believer, when God exists, sends you to heaven. So negative utility, infinite, and positive infinite utility. Now, being an atheist and God doesn't exist gives you a bunch of extra utility because you've learned so many new languages on Duolingo in your Sundays and spare evenings. And being a believer when God doesn't exist means that you've wasted time praying and going to church, so you lose 500 utility. All of a sudden, we don't have a dominance because belief sometimes gives you less utility. However, one still ought to, according to Pascal's wager, believe in God, because the risk of negative infinite utility is so much greater than the negative 500 utility that you would get here. And so when we're comparing the negative outcomes, our best outcome for maximizing utility, remember when we maximize utility, we run through our equation, we're going to determine that it's still better to believe. And here's how we run that equation. Here's our equation, right? Our probability theory right here. What we're going to do is the expected utility of believing is just the probability of God's existence times the utility that we get when God does exist, plus the probability that God doesn't exist times the utility of the case in which God doesn't actually exist, right? The consequence and the act multiplied by the consequence, the other consequence, and the same act. So the expected utility of belief of this act is going to be 0.5 times this and 0.5 times this added together, which turns out is positive infinity, right? That half of infinity is still infinity, and half of negative 500 is negative 250. Negative 250 plus positive infinity is still positive infinity. The expected utility of not believing and being an atheist is 0.5 times negative infinity plus 0.5 times 1,000, right? Because it's a 0.5 probability is a perfect agnostic as to whether or not God exists. And that, likewise, is going to turn out to be negative infinity. So when we compare the expected utilities of these two acts of believing and of not believing, turns out that we always ought to choose just so long as we're interested in maximizing utility, and this is what we believe the probabilities and utilities to be, then we ought to believe, right? Because believing yields us more expected utility than not believing. And that's Pascal's wager. Either belief dominates, and we just ought to choose it, right? Because it's just a matter of fiat of the power of the utility distribution. That belief dominates. Therefore, as a matter of practical rationality, we ought to believe, even if belief doesn't dominate, right? There's a case in which belief will yield us less utility in a certain circumstance. Because of these infinite distributions of utilities, it doesn't matter what our probabilities are, and it doesn't matter what the alternative consequences are, that the expected utility of belief is always higher than the expected utility of non-belief. Now, Pascal recognized that just looking at this isn't going to make you really believe in God. So your wager all of a sudden like, dang, I don't want to go to hell. I better believe in God, right? Pascal, you've convinced me. But even then, it seems sort of a shallow form of belief, right? That just because I'm looking out for my best interests, for maximizing my own utility, I believe in God, right? Pascal recognized this, and he argued that a person who accepts his wager and believes in God at first has this shallow form of belief, but then as they participate in the church and in the forms of activity that are required by belief and commitment to belief, that eventually true faith will develop, and thus the people who accept the wager will become real believers and thereby be able to go to heaven. In fact, I believe this was his own story for himself. Pascal was a bit of a bohemian womanizer, gambler, drinker for many years, much of his young life, and he invented probability theory in order to become better at gambling, and then got bored with it, and so began to apply his probabilistic thinking to theological problems, and thus we get the wager. So, that being said, what's wrong with the argument? Well, one of the main objections that's raised against Pascal's wager is called the many gods problem. It's a really fun problem to look at, and not only is it interesting in virtue of the form of argument, but also in virtue of its helping, hopefully, to make robust our understanding of expected value theory. So Pascal assumes that there are only two choices, two outcomes. But this is not strictly true. The whole practical argument rests upon the existence or non-existence of the Christian God. But what if other gods can exist as well? Then our practical choice will have to change. So Pascal assumes that there are only two choices between the existence or non-existence of our Christian God. But if there are other gods as well, say Zeus or Bahamut or whatever, right, that there become other choices, that our chart is too small and we need to fill it out for extra acts and extra consequences. So, imagine, here's the problem. Imagine that there's not only the possibility that the all-good Christian God exists, but that another too may exist among the many pantheons and sects of gods postulated by the multitude of world religions. We are only interested in the possible existence of this particular God. This God is an evil trickster who condemns sloppy practical reasoning. He is spiteful and full of wrath. When believers are deceived and rely on their poor and meager personal interests, their maximizing of utility, to infer that the almighty and good Christian God exists, our spiteful trickster is beset with anger. He despises those who forsake and forget him. Those who believe in the Christian God are punished. Yet those who are made agnostic do not commit to such a terrible crime for our trickster, and may yet go to heaven. So, with only one God, this is what our chart looks like, right? That God exists or doesn't exist, and we either believe or don't believe. But according to the many gods objection, this is too simple. This isn't enough. We need to add some extra acts and an extra outcome. So Pascal's partitions will change. So our acts is we can act as an atheist, or we can act as a believer, and these remain the same. But likewise, we can also act as an agnostic. And the Christian God can exist, the trickster God can exist, or no God can exist. And if we're a believer and God exists, we go to heaven. But if we are a believer in the Christian God and the trickster God exists, he sends us to hell because he hates nasty practical reasoning, bad practical reasoning. But if we're a believer and no God exists, then maybe we just wasted our time on Sunday, right? And so negative 500 utility. Now, for the case in which we act as an agnostic, if we don't believe in God, right, because we're agnostic, God sends us to hell, maybe just the first layer if you're into Dante, whatever. If you're agnostic and the trickster God exists, the trickster God thinks, I respect your skepticism, you get to go to heaven. Infinite utility. And if you're agnostic and no God exists, then you spend a bunch of time learning extra languages, 500 utility. If you're an atheist and the Christian God exists, you go to hell. If you're an atheist and the trickster God exists, he, again, is spiteful towards your bad practical reasoning, towards your non-skepticism, and so also sends you to hell. But if you're an atheist, then you not only didn't spend your Sundays going to church, but you also didn't spend your evenings worrying about whether or not you ought to believe in God, as an agnostic might. Therefore, you get 1,000 utility. And so, of course, nothing dominates because there's not one state of affairs that in one act that has a higher utility and never less utility than others. And this is because we see that there's a positive infinity appearing in two parts of our chart, in the middle and on the top left when facing the chart. So what we need to do is we need to run a utility calculus. So what's the expected utility of believing? Well, it's the probability of God existing times its utility, plus the probability of the trickster God existing times negative infinity, plus the probability of no God existing times negative 100. These two are going to cancel themselves out because positive infinity plus negative infinity is 0. So our answer is just going to be the expected utility of believing in the Christian God is just going to be the probability of no God existing times negative 100. The expected utility of being an agnostic of x here is, again, negative infinity times positive infinity, or plus positive infinity times, or plus the probability of n times 500. And again, our negative and positive infinity will cancel each other out. And so the expected utility of being agnostic is whatever the probability of not believing times 500 is. And finally, the expected utility of disbelief of being an atheist is going to be negative infinity because we don't have any positive infinities to do any canceling. So in the case of the trickster God, we still probably don't want to be atheists, but it appears that that we're at a loss for how to decide whether or not to be an agnostic or to believe, sort of depending on what these probabilities are or how we assign these utilities. So all of a sudden, our wager doesn't give us such an easy answer to the problem. When we consider the notion of the jealous and spiteful trickster God, our answer to this problem is no longer as clear as Pascal once thought it was. No utility dominates the bunch, and crucially, what we ought to do depends on the utilities assigned in this third column. How we decide our utilities here go, and how the probabilities play themselves out. If we're perfectly agnostic about probabilities, then we would assign 0.33, 33333 probabilities to each of these. And what we ought to do depends on how we assign utilities over here, because these probabilities will cancel each other out in our expected utility calculus. So the wager, as it turns out, given this many gods objection, simply postulates the possibility, the logical possibility, of a different kind of God existing with a different set of values. And if these other gods exist with other values, or could exist, then we need to change the way in which we measure our practical decision heuristic using the maximization of utility and expected outcome benefit. And when we do so, we find that we're not going to be able to conclude as clearly and precisely and succinctly as Pascal did that one simply ought to wager on God. Okay, and that's it. So this concludes our discussion of proofs for God's existence, arguments for wagering on God, and it sort of hopefully has been a nice wrap up to the course's objectives to give you insight into forms of argument, into deductive logic, inductive logic, and then a little splash of practical reasoning and game theory. Hopefully this class has been fantastic and helpful and fun. I've had a really great time interacting with all of you, even through the online version that this has been. And I hope you've enjoyed the course. And if you won't take more logic classes going forward or more philosophy classes, that at least what we've learned over the course of the summer will help you all going forward in your lives, wherever those lead you. Okay, thanks guys.